and I'd like to thank you for inviting me today to talk about this very controversial and challenging topic that is being debated continuously among the scientific community in invasive species biology and ecology. As many of you know, the role of the Research Institute is to bridge the gap between research and management. And so what I'd like to do today is do a little bit of an overview of the discussion that's going around this topic. And so I think that, let me see if I can advance here. Okay, so I'd like to start kind of at the beginning here where Charles Elton was the first to really publish on this issue. While it's been discussed among Darwin's works and by other biologists over the years, the first to really define a focused scientific study of invasive biology and ecology was Charles Elton in 1958. And it was at this time that he actually distinguished between two different kinds of outbreaks, as he called them. So two rather different kinds of outbreaks in populations, those that occur because a foreign species successfully invades another country, and those that happen in native or long-established populations. So his book published on the invaders, as he calls them, and he basically started years of debate and discussion with this book. But here in New York State, we also have some working definitions of what we consider a native and a non-native species and an invasive species. So I think it's really important in this conversation for us to lay out this groundwork. As many of you know, because you are working in New York State defines an invasive species as a species that is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And for the purposes of this part, the harm must significantly outweigh any benefits. And I quote this from the DUC, as many of you already know. And I also just wanted to include this little snippet at the bottom from the National Invasive Species Council. They also share that they have the same definition. And this is actually an 11-page document that is working to explain this definition and clarify what this means. And so this right there, if you need an 11-page document to clarify it, already can introduce us to the complexity of a definition such as this one. And this is, since we're talking about non-native, it's also important to define what native is. Means with respect to a particular ecosystem, a species other than as a result of an introduction historically occurred or currently occurs in that ecosystem or in New York State, which we'll get back to in a moment, and defines an ecosystem as the complex community of organisms and its environment functioning as an interactive unit. Now, there are some challenges with the proposed definitions that are also continuously debated as they discuss this issue. These kinds of definitions don't really reflect ecological reality because political boundaries can't really separate the interconnection of ecosystems. And ecosystems are a network of interactions among the biota in the physical environment. And so ecosystems are never closed, and by definition, they're constantly changing and influenced as much by internal interactions as by outside forces. And so that also makes our defining what's native and not native very difficult. At this current time, as we all know, there's climate change and land use change, which are really accelerating the expansion and shifting of ranges of species across the globe. And another challenge that we have with this definition is that when we talk about native and we talk about historic, that's very vague. It doesn't talk about what date are we really thinking about. Are we thinking about the 1800s, pre-colonization? We don't really have a time frame to go with when that would be considered native and when it would be considered an introduced species. And another factor that also gets complicated with this is how did it arrive to the new ecosystem? Was it a range expansion or was it human transport? And was the range expansion due to human-induced climate change? And so I don't mean to go through this with so much detail, but this all feeds into the current debate that's so difficult to work out in this area. I think another really important thing to touch on as we talk about this is what we're actually striving to achieve. And as defined, we're striving to maintain the ecosystem, the biodiversity, productivity, and aesthetic value. So it's the ecological aspect. We're trying to protect human health, and we're trying to prevent economic loss. And I think it's really important to consider whether management actions will allow us to achieve these goals. So with that groundwork, I'll move into the growing debate around invasive biology. And what has been really discussed is the fact that we can't really judge a species on their origins. And so a non-native species doesn't necessarily have negative impacts. And the native species can have negative impacts if its populations grow beyond control. And so this is just a few select titles, but there's so many out there of the constant publications that are coming out in the scientific literature around this. In fact, there's groups coming saying we need to end invasion biology as a scientific discipline, and then we have people calling for an end to the call for an end, which I almost find this amusing, this constant and continual exchange. They're saying that native and alien invasive plants are similar, that it's traits, not origin, that explains how impacts of plants the impacts that plants would have on amphibians. So these are just a few examples of the kind of issue that's being discussed right now. We even have scientists, well-known scientists in the field, they're suggesting a new discipline to replace invasion biology that can incorporate this idea that native species can be equally as disruptive to ecosystem functioning, and that this change is a natural process. So they're trying to, this is just one idea, the spread ecology from Mark Davis in 2009, but there's other calls for reconsideration of invasion biology, and it would permit a more integrated study that would incorporate climate change, land use change, human transport, and other factors into the equation. Now, some of the most recent research is showing that invasive species, and they use invasive species here talking about species that actually their population grows out of control and dominates an environment, or that have a negative impact, but they're saying that invasive species differ significantly from non-invasive species, but the attributes of invasive aliens, and they're considering these non-native species, are not unique. Most are shared by invasive native species. So basically, when you're seeing a weedy plant that's native, and you're seeing an exotic invasive species, they have the same traits, and they behave, if I may use that word for plants, in the same way. And that's not only the case for plants, it's also the case for animals. And as we see even some examples here in New York State where white-tailed deer, for example, are having enormous impacts on our environment. They're posing a health risk to humans. They are causing great economic loss, but there's actually difficulty in controlling them due to many factors, whereas feral swine, on the other hand, could simply just be eradicated because of their negative impacts because their origin was different. We have Canada goose and mute swan, also similar negative impacts, similar behavior, but one is native and one is not native, and it makes us treat them differently. And finally, just a newer introduction into the state of New York is the southern pine beetle, that has a devastating effect on forests, huge economic loss, huge health risks, is compared to the emerald ash borer. And so these are just examples of where the native and the non-native species have very similar negative impacts. And so throughout this literature, they did recognize there were certain times when non-native species should be treated differently than native species, even if they both have negative impacts. And obviously, I put our very familiar invasion curve here just to point out the fact that it's usually in regard to new arrivals or prevention because of the risk and uncertainty that we have about new species coming in. However, once established an invasive native and an invasive non-native, it should be treated in a similar way. I'd like to touch a little bit on an example, and likely the reason why I was invited to talk about this subject was the recent occurrence in New York State of the southern pine beetle. And when the southern pine beetle arrived in 2014, there was a lot of discussion on whether this should be treated as an invasive species or a native pest. And so there's been no documented records of the southern pine beetle in New York since they first started performing systematic entomological surveys in 1800s. Then it's native to southern pine ecosystem and to pine barrens ecosystem, and it's a highly destructive forest pest with the ability to rapidly change forest type. I was approached as the New York Invasive Species Research Institute to consult experts on this to try to determine whether this should be treated as an invasive species or as a nuisance species. And we surveyed 30 experts. We received 12 responses with weighting in the direction of saying that it is a native pest. And most everybody who said that felt that it was because of climate change. It was allowed to move north. Although people debated whether it was that it's an invasive native and started confusing the terminology and not confusing, but simply discussing the matter using different definitions. And a few people who felt that it was invasive because it's never been present in Long Island or in New York before. Now, what difference will this make? Why does it really matter whether we treat it as an invasive species or a native pest? And in this case, what was interesting was really about where would the management resources come from? Would they come from an invasive species emergency response fund, or would they come from a forest management fund? And so that was a really big issue in regards to the southern pine beetle. And also, who would actually be responsible for this? Would it be the Invasive Species Coordination Unit and Invasive Species PRISM that is working in the region, or would it be a different entity? And I think that is where the really big difference was in this case. And in fact, our number one expert on this, Dr. Matt Eyre from Dartmouth College, he really summarized it nicely in saying the administrative decision on whether STD is an invasive species under New York law should not affect the practical responses. And in fact, it didn't. And we actually saw a wonderful coordinated response from the DEC, but it would have been done in the same way had it been an invasive or a native. So just in trying to summarize a little bit of this, some of the take-home messages would be that it's really important for us to have clear objective setting with metrics for assessment when we're thinking about invasive species management, independent of whether it's a native or a non-native species. That non-native really doesn't always mean invasive or imply that it would have negative impacts, and that native species can behave as an invasive species per se and can have negative impacts. also that our land use changes and climate change will require us to rethink the current definitions and management decisions that we're making. And they're really just in general to finalize that there's a really a need for a greater understanding of invasive species impacts, and that we can't simply base our management decisions on whether they're native or not native. And we also propose here that we'd like to get managers more involved in this assessment and in this collection of data and assessing impacts. And so that's pretty much a summary for today in this short amount of time that we have to discuss the matter that's been discussed in such detail. But I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I'd also be happy to point out further resources for those of you who would like to delve deeper to the topic.